Caden Voss's ship shuddered as it passed through the dense cloud of dust surrounding Death Moon. The once active mining satellite was now a silent wasteland, its craters deep and shadows long. He had been sent to survey for potential colonization, but something about the reports from the orbital scans had made him uneasy. There was an irregular pattern of life signatures, almost human-like but faint and scattered. It had puzzled the command center back on Terra Station. Caden gripped the controls, adjusting the landing thrusters carefully. One wrong move and the ship could be lost to the jagged terrain below. The surface of Death Moon was a mix of black rock and glowing mineral veins, pulsating faintly with colors that made the barren land look strangely alive. The air was thin and cold, with a faint hum running through the atmosphere, something he could feel vibrating in his bones. He stepped out of the ship, his boots crunching against the icy dust. The landscape was quiet, almost too quiet. It reminded him of a graveyard, empty, lifeless, yet holding echoes of something long forgotten. Caden scanned the horizon. A faint shimmer caught his eye, moving slowly among the craters. His brow furrowed. The movement was deliberate, not random, and it seemed almost alive. He activated his scanner, sweeping the area for life forms. The signature was weak but distinct, a single being, not human yet intelligent. His heart picked up. Whoever or whatever it was, it had survived here for some time, alone with no one to help. He moved cautiously toward the shimmer, every step careful on the jagged rocks. The further he went, the more he realized the being was not human at all. It was tall and slender, with a body covered in faint scales that caught the light from his suit. Wings, folded against its back, shimmered with an unusual iridescence, reflecting the colors of the minerals around them. Its face was sharp yet elegant, with bright eyes that seemed both cautious and curious. It was a dragon-like humanoid, a dragon woman, alive in the middle of this forsaken world. Caden slowed, not wanting to frighten her. The dragon woman stood frozen, clearly weak from exposure and lack of food. Her scales were dull in places, and her wings drooped as though they could not support her fully. He saw signs of injury, old scars from some past struggle. Yet, despite her fragile state, her eyes held a spark, a stubborn, intelligent light that told him she had survived through sheer will. He activated his translator and spoke in calm tones. "Hello. I'm Caden Voss. I mean you no harm. Can you understand me?" The dragon woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. There was a long pause, and then a faint mental pulse brushed against his mind, not words but emotion. Fear, confusion, hesitation, and curiosity. Caden understood. She was wary but not entirely hostile. He took another step, slowly lowering his hands. "I'm here to help," he said. "You don't have to be alone." For a moment she hesitated, then made a low, almost musical sound. Her wings twitched and she moved slightly toward him. It was not fast but deliberate. Caden held his ground, waiting. She stopped a few meters away and he could sense her studying him, trying to decide if he was a threat. The environment on Death Moon was unforgiving. Temperatures dropped quickly as the twin moons began their descent, shadows stretching across the rocky surface. The wind carried sharp, mineral-laden dust that cut at exposed skin. Caden glanced at her wings and noticed frost forming along the edges. She was in danger if she stayed outside much longer. Without hesitation, he motioned toward his ship. "Come with me. I can give you warmth, food, shelter." The dragon woman's eyes flickered, and he sensed a mix of surprise and consideration. She was clearly primitive in her survival instincts, having lived alone, but intelligent enough to evaluate his offer. Slowly she stepped closer, one cautious movement at a time. Caden kept his voice steady, his movements calm, so she would not feel threatened. When she finally reached the ship, she hesitated at the entrance. The door was wide and the inside looked strange and foreign to her. Her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air, taking in the warmth and scent of machinery. Caden extended a hand, not to grab but to guide. She stepped inside, her claws lightly touching the floor, making small, cautious sounds. Once inside, she folded her wings gently, curling them against her back. The warmth of the ship seemed to revive her slightly. Caden offered a small pack of synthesized protein bars and water, but she stared at it, unsure. Slowly, with his encouragement, she took the food. Her scales began to shine faintly again, reflecting the interior lights. He noticed her wings twitch in small movements, stretching slightly as if testing strength. Caden took a deep breath. "You're safe for now," he said softly. "But you need rest, warmth, and guidance. I can help with that." Her eyes studied him, bright and intelligent, and he could feel a silent understanding pass between them. She had survived Death Moon alone, abandoned and primitive, but now for the first time in her life she was not alone. Caden realized something profound. She was not just a creature to be saved, she was a being of value, capable of thought, feeling, and perhaps even trust. The twin moons rose higher, casting soft light into the ship. Outside, the cold wind howled across the surface, rattling the hull. Inside, warmth spread slowly, carrying the faint scent of metal and heat. Caden watched the dragon woman, now sitting quietly, wrapping her wings around herself for comfort. He realized she had no name he could pronounce yet, and perhaps no understanding of humans, but that did not matter. He smiled faintly. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Together." For the first time on Death Moon, there was more than silence. There was connection, fragile but real. Caden Holt, the human astronaut, had found a forsaken dragon woman in the middle of an abandoned, deadly world. She had survived countless dangers alone, but now with him her life had a chance to change. And in that moment, as the cold night pressed against the ship and the twin moons glowed above the forsaken land, both human and dragon woman understood something without words. They had found each other. Survival was only the beginning. Something new, something extraordinary, was about to begin. Caden Voss watched the dragon woman carefully as she explored the interior of his ship. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, touching the walls and instruments with her claws, her eyes wide with curiosity. Everything was strange to her, the lights, the panels, the humming of the life support systems. Her wings twitched occasionally, brushing against the ceiling, and Caden had to guide her gently, making sure she did not damage anything or hurt herself. He realized that if she was going to survive, she needed more than just food and warmth. She needed understanding. He activated a holographic translator and began with simple words, pointing to objects as he spoke. "Food," he said, holding up a protein bar. She tilted her head, studying it. Slowly she reached out a claw and touched it. Her eyes widened and she sniffed it carefully before tasting it. A soft hiss of approval escaped her throat. Caden smiled. "One small step." "Water," he said next, pointing to the hydration unit. She approached cautiously, dipping her fingers into the clear liquid. She drank carefully, then looked up at him, her eyes shining with comprehension. It was a small victory, but it meant she could learn. She could understand. Over the next few hours, Caden taught her more, basic gestures, simple speech, and even some of the ship's systems. Lysra, as he decided to call her, was intelligent but primitive. She had instincts that kept her alive for years alone, yet she had no knowledge of technology or human customs. Every lesson was a mixture of frustration and triumph. When she succeeded, her small chirps and wing twitches showed excitement. When she failed, she did not give up, simply trying again. At one point, she hesitated near the control panel that adjusted gravity within the ship. Her wings flapped nervously as she stared at the buttons. Caden knelt beside her. "It's okay. You don't have to touch everything at once. I'll show you." He guided her claw gently over the controls, and the gravity shifted slightly. Lysra flinched at first but then laughed, a soft melodic sound that echoed through the cabin. Caden laughed too, realizing how much progress she had made in just a few hours. As the day passed, they shared stories in the only way they could. Caden spoke of human space travel, of planets and moons, and Lysra responded with images in his mind, visions of her people soaring over high mountains and using her draconic powers to hunt and protect. He learned that she had been stranded when her clan had fled from a larger human expedition long ago. Her people had left her behind, assuming she could not survive, but she had. The story was filled with courage, and Caden could not help but admire her. Despite her primitive state, Lysra began to understand empathy and cooperation. She mimicked his gestures, learning to respond to his commands and even anticipating his needs. When he handed her a blanket, she wrapped herself carefully and then returned the gesture, placing her wing near his shoulder as if to share warmth. Caden realized that she was learning trust, not just words or actions. The environment of Death Moon added urgency to their lessons. Outside, the winds howled and the air was thin and cold. The surface was dangerous, full of unstable terrain and sharp mineral formations. Caden knew that if Lysra were to survive beyond the safety of his ship, she needed to understand both human technology and the natural dangers of the moon. He taught her how to read the external sensors, how to judge the wind patterns, and how to move safely across the surface. Her instincts were sharp, but Caden's guidance made her even more capable. By evening, Lysra had begun to use small gestures to communicate directly with him. A flap of her wings could mean curiosity, a tilt of her head could mean agreement, and a soft hiss indicated caution. Caden marveled at her intelligence and adaptability. In some ways she was like a child learning for the first time. In other ways she was wise beyond human understanding, guided by instincts honed over years of survival. They spent time near the observation window looking out at the frozen landscape. Lysra seemed fascinated by the twin moons and the jagged craters below. Caden pointed to distant formations, explaining how gravity and wind shaped them. She listened intently, her eyes following his gestures, occasionally reaching out to touch the glass. For a moment he wondered if she had ever seen the sky before, or if she had only known caves and darkness. Caden realized something important. Lysra was more than a being to be protected. She had a mind, a spirit, and a personality. Teaching her was not just about survival, it was about connection. And with that connection came a responsibility he had never felt before. He could not simply leave her here to fend for herself again. He would help her grow, teach her, and guide her into a life where she could thrive, not just survive. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. Caden activated additional heating coils, and Lysra huddled closer to him. She was beginning to understand affection, comfort, and safety. When he offered her a warm drink, she accepted it carefully, then leaned slightly toward him in what seemed like gratitude. He realized that she had begun to trust him completely, a rare gift for someone who had been alone and abandoned for so long. Caden reflected on the events of the day. He had found Lysra on a forsaken moon, a primitive dragon woman struggling to survive. But through patience, guidance, and simple kindness, he had begun to teach her understanding of language, technology, and human thought. In return, she had shared glimpses of her own world, her resilience, and her intelligence. He had never expected to find such a connection, yet here it was, fragile and precious. For the first time in years, Caden felt a sense of purpose beyond duty or mission objectives. He was no longer just an astronaut exploring an abandoned moon. He was a guide, a protector, and a teacher to a unique life form. Lysra had opened a door to a new kind of relationship, one built on trust, respect, and the simple act of understanding. As they both settled near the warm glow of the ship's core, Caden watched Lysra curl up beside him, her wings folding carefully around her. She closed her eyes, exhausted from learning and exploring, yet her mind seemed alive with curiosity even in sleep. Caden knew that this was only the beginning. There was much to teach, much to learn, and much to discover about her, and about himself. And in that quiet, glowing cabin on Death Moon, a human and a dragon woman began a journey of learning, understanding, and trust. They had survived the storm, survived isolation, and now they would survive together, discovering new ways to communicate, connect, and grow. The moon outside was harsh and unforgiving, but inside, a new bond had formed, one that could endure any challenge. The days on Death Moon passed slowly, but each day brought new challenges. Caden Voss and Lysra had grown more comfortable together. She had learned simple words, gestures, and even the basics of the ship's systems. Yet the moon itself remained a dangerous, unpredictable place. Caden had always trained for isolation in space, but nothing had prepared him for the kind of loneliness that came from knowing the world outside was harsh and unyielding, and that Lysra had faced it for years before him. The storm had passed, leaving jagged ice cliffs and unstable craters across the surface. Caden decided it was time to check the surrounding area for resources. Lysra followed, her wings folded against her back, claws carefully stepping on the icy rocks. Her scales had regained some of their shine, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity and determination. Yet even in her growing strength, he could sense the fragility beneath. She had survived alone this long, but the isolation had shaped her, sometimes making her wary, sometimes reckless. As they climbed a ridge, the wind howled sharply, carrying fine ice shards that stung exposed skin. Caden adjusted his suit and motioned for Lysra to stay close. "We can't stay here long," he said. She tilted her head, understanding in her own way, and kept near him. He scanned the horizon with the ship's portable sensor. There was little to find, frozen mineral outcrops and the occasional geothermal vent, but nothing that could provide sustainable warmth or food for the long term. The threat of isolation became more than a practical concern. Caden realized that Lysra's experience of being abandoned had left deep impressions. She would act instinctively, avoiding humans or trusting them too easily, depending on her instincts. He had to build a bridge between her world and his, but the clock of survival was ticking. If they stayed on Death Moon too long without a plan, they could face hunger, exposure, or worse, psychological strain from the endless loneliness. Lysra suddenly froze, her body tensing. Her sharp eyes focused on a distant crater where the surface shimmered unnaturally. Caden followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing, but then a low vibration ran through the ground, a minor quake likely caused by geothermal activity. Lysra hissed softly, wings twitching nervously. Caden stepped closer. "It's okay. It's just the moon shifting. Nothing can reach us." He tried to reassure her, but he could feel her tension. She had survived quakes and dangers alone before, but the presence of a human beside her seemed to confuse her instincts. They continued cautiously, moving toward the geothermal vent that might offer warmth and shelter. The ground was treacherous, cracks forming underfoot, and Caden had to guide her carefully. At one point, Lysra lost her footing, sliding dangerously close to a jagged edge. Caden grabbed her by the wing gently, steadying her. She looked at him, eyes wide, then flapped her wings softly. It was gratitude, trust, and understanding, all rolled into one. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The twins' moon's light barely penetrated the icy clouds, leaving the landscape dark and eerie. Caden and Lysra huddled near the geothermal vent. He shared his warmth, and she adjusted her wings around herself. He could feel her body relaxing slowly, but he knew the emotional strain of isolation was harder to ease than the physical cold. Caden realized that she had survived alone for years, but that survival had come at a cost. She had learned to rely solely on instincts, to avoid danger at all times, and to fend for herself without any help. Trust was alien to her. Yet now, through patience and presence, he had begun to teach her that someone could be a companion without being a threat. It was fragile like ice underfoot, but it was growing. The next day, Caden worked with her to explore a small cave near the vent. It offered protection from wind and falling ice, but the space was narrow. He showed her how to store supplies, how to create a small warm corner with thermal blankets, and how to recognize safe spots in case of a sudden quake. Lysra mimicked his actions carefully, sometimes hesitating but always learning. He noticed her tail curling instinctively for balance, wings flicking occasionally to maintain control. Her primitive instincts were strong, but they were slowly merging with what he could teach her. Caden began to talk to her more, telling her about the human worlds, the ships, and the way humans cooperated to survive in hostile environments. She listened, sometimes tilting her head, sometimes peering at the equipment he showed her. Slowly he realized she was beginning to grasp more abstract ideas. Trust, companionship, planning ahead, not just immediate survival. Still, the threat of isolation lingered. When Caden needed to scan the moon's surface from a small outcrop, Lysra insisted on accompanying him. She had learned to trust him, but the fear of being left alone ran deep. He let her, knowing that forcing separation would break the fragile bond they were forming. Together, they observed the horizon, noting potential hazards and resource locations. Each shared glance and silent communication reinforced their growing partnership. As night approached again, the moons casting faint blue light over the icy cliffs, Caden realized the bond they were forming was rare. Humans had always been explorers, teachers, and companions to each other, but forming such a connection across species was unusual. Lysra had been abandoned, primitive, and alone, yet she was learning to adapt, to trust, and to rely on another being. That trust was precious and delicate, and he would protect it. The long hours of darkness gave them time to reflect. Lysra curled beside him, eyes half closed, yet alert to the slightest sound. Caden placed a hand gently on her scaled arm. "We'll survive this," he whispered. "Together. You're not alone anymore." She leaned slightly against him, and for the first time he sensed a genuine, unspoken understanding. The threat of isolation had not disappeared, it would always be a shadow, but they had found a way to face it together. Lysra had survived the dangers of Death Moon alone for years, but now she had someone beside her, someone she could trust. Caden smiled faintly as he looked at the twin moons rising over the icy horizon. Survival had brought them together, but trust would keep them alive. The human and the dragon woman had begun to learn from each other, to rely on each other, and to find hope where before there was only abandonment. Isolation had been her greatest enemy, but together, they were learning to overcome it. And in that quiet, cold night, under the pale moons of Death Moon, Caden Voss and Lysra took another step toward a future neither of them could have imagined. One where survival was no longer solitary but shared. Caden Voss stood at the edge of the icy cliff, looking out across the barren expanse of Death Moon. The twin moons cast pale light on the jagged rocks, and the cold wind cut through his suit like knives. Beside him, Lysra shifted slightly, her wings folding and unfolding as she watched the horizon. She had grown stronger over the past weeks, learning from him, trusting him, and slowly adapting to a life beyond survival. Yet the loneliness of the moon remained, and the weight of choice pressed on Caden. He knew he had a decision to make. He could leave Death Moon, return to human space, and report the dragon woman he had found. Protocol would demand her relocation, study, or containment. That was the human way: control, observation, and regulation. Yet he had come to know Lysera as more than an anomaly or a mission objective. She was intelligent, sensitive, and alive. Leaving her behind or handing her over would feel like betrayal. Lysera tilted her head, sensing the tension in him. Though her understanding of humans was still primitive, she could feel emotions clearly. Trust and fear, curiosity and caution, all ran through her like pulses. She stepped closer, brushing her tail lightly against his leg. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. She was asking him to stay, to protect her, to choose her over the uncertain safety of human rules. Caden sighed, feeling the gravity of the choice. He recalled the moment he had first found her, weak and abandoned in the shadow of a crater. She had survived for years, relying only on instinct, yet she had reached out to him, had accepted his help, and had learned to trust him. Could he abandon her now, after all that? Could he return to the bureaucracy of human command and leave a being like Lysera to face isolation again? "I can't leave you," he whispered, though she did not need words to understand. Her wings twitched slightly, her eyes brightening with recognition. Caden reached out, gently resting his hand on her scaled arm. The warmth of his touch seemed to calm her, and he realized that trust could be as fragile as the thin ice under their feet, yet just as strong if nurtured. The decision was made in that moment. Caden would not leave. He would stay with Lysera, guide her, and help her survive on Death Moon until they could find a better place, or perhaps create one. But the choice carried more than safety, it carried commitment. He would not be merely a temporary protector. He would be a companion, a guide, and a partner. Lysera responded in her own way. She stepped closer, wings folding against her back, tail curling around her legs. She nudged him gently, and Caden felt a surge of connection. Though primitive, she had begun to understand companionship, empathy, and loyalty. The bond between them had grown beyond survival. It had become trust, respect, and something deeper, an unspoken partnership that neither had anticipated but both needed. Caden began to plan. Leaving the moon entirely was risky, but they could find a nearby safe zone, a place where Lysera could learn and grow without the constant threat of isolation. He taught her more about the ship, navigation, and basic survival techniques in human terms, while also encouraging her to use her natural instincts. She was a unique being, part dragon, part sentient humanoid, and her abilities could be strengthened, not suppressed. As the days passed, Caden noticed subtle changes in Lysera. Her movements became more confident, her eyes sharper, and her wings stronger. She began to explore small areas of the ship independently, remembering lessons he had taught and even improvising new solutions to simple problems. He realized that staying with her was not just an act of protection, it was a chance to learn from her as well. Her instincts and senses surpassed human abilities in many ways, and her perspective offered insights he could not have imagined. Yet the choice weighed heavily. Human command would not understand this connection. Reports would demand she be taken for study or observation. He could face reprimand, even career consequences. But Caden had learned long ago that courage was not only measured by surviving storms or navigating space, it was measured by making choices that honored life and trust. And he could not betray the trust Lysera had placed in him. One evening, under the twin moons, Caden and Lysera sat near a warm vent in the rocky shelter. The wind howled outside, rattling the metal walls, but inside there was quiet. He looked at her, seeing the mix of curiosity and caution, strength and fragility. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. "I'll stay with you. I won't leave you alone again." Lysera tilted her head, then extended a claw lightly toward him, placing it over his hand. The gesture was simple yet profound. It was agreement, trust, and acceptance. Caden realized then that the choice was mutual. He had chosen her, and she had chosen him in her own way. Together they would face whatever challenges the moon, or the universe, threw at them. The human choice was clear: leave or stay, follow orders or follow heart. Caden had chosen heart. He would remain on Death Moon, not as a rescuer who comes and goes, but as a companion who would build a life alongside Lysera. That choice changed everything. It transformed survival into partnership, loneliness into companionship, and duty into devotion. In the following days, Caden worked on upgrading the shelter. He reinforced structures, improved heating systems, and created small observation areas where Lysera could safely explore without danger. He taught her to recognize patterns in the environment, understand minor hazards, and even read simple signals from his instruments. Lysera in turn began teaching him subtle ways to read the moon's energy flows, using her natural instincts to sense shifts in the wind and ground. Their cooperation was seamless, blending human knowledge with draconic intuition. Caden knew that the choice to stay had also opened the door to a new life. One where human and dragon could learn from each other, survive together, and perhaps even thrive. It was not a simple path, but it was meaningful. And meaning mattered more than protocol or distance or the cold bureaucracy of human space command. One night, as the twin moons rose over the jagged horizon, Caden and Lysera stood together on a ridge overlooking the frozen landscape. The winds whispered through the craters, carrying the faint hum of minerals shifting beneath the surface. Lysera's wings stretched slightly, catching the moonlight, while her tail curled gently around her legs. Caden felt a deep sense of purpose, a clarity he had not felt in years. He had made the choice and the consequences would follow, but he knew he had chosen rightly. For the first time since discovering her, Caden felt that the future held possibilities beyond mere survival. Together they would face the threats of the moon, the dangers of isolation, and the challenges of bridging two worlds. The human choice had been made, and with it, a new chapter in both their lives had begun. A chapter of trust, understanding, and partnership. Caden looked at Lysera and she returned his gaze. In that silent moment, the weight of choice and responsibility transformed into hope. The forsaken dragon woman on Death Moon was no longer alone, and the human astronaut had committed himself fully to a path that neither protocol nor isolation could undo. Together they would navigate the perils of the moon and beyond, learning, growing, and forging a bond that would endure far longer than any storm or trial the universe could offer. Caden Voss stood at the entrance of the shelter, watching the pale light of the twin moons spread across the icy surface of Death Moon. The wind had softened, leaving the world silent except for the faint hum of the geothermal vents. Lysera emerged from the warm corner they had created together, her wings stretching slowly, catching the faint moonlight. She looked stronger now, more confident, her scales gleaming with health. She had learned to trust him, to move carefully across the dangerous terrain, and to understand that she no longer needed to survive alone. Caden smiled, a warm feeling spreading through him. For the first time in years he did not feel the cold bite of isolation. He had chosen to stay with Lysera, and that choice had transformed their lives. She was no longer a forsaken dragon woman. She was his companion, his equal, and together, they had built a small, safe world amid the harshness of the moon. He watched as Lysera walked to the edge of the ridge, her claws digging lightly into the frozen ground. She lifted her wings and stretched them fully, and he could see the grace in her movements. She had begun exploring the world around them carefully, testing the limits of the terrain while staying close enough to him to feel safe. The bond between them had grown strong, built not just on survival but on mutual respect and understanding. "Come," Caden said softly, gesturing toward a safer path down the ridge. Lysera obeyed immediately, flapping her wings slightly to maintain balance as she descended. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and careful. He realized she had become more than a learner. She was a partner now, capable of making decisions and acting with intelligence beyond instinct alone. They spent the day exploring a nearby crater that contained a small natural spring. The warm water provided relief from the cold, and Caden showed Lysera how to filter and collect it for later use. She watched him closely, mimicking his movements, and then experimented on her own, using her claws with surprising delicacy to remove impurities. Caden felt a sense of pride. She had learned so much so quickly, and yet she retained her natural instincts, blending them with what he had taught her. When the sun, or the brighter of the twin moons, began to rise higher, they returned to the shelter. Caden reinforced the walls, checking for cracks or weak points caused by previous storms. Lysera assisted in her own way, using her strength to move heavy debris and her wings to adjust insulation panels. They worked together efficiently, communicating through gestures, simple words, and understanding that went beyond language. As night approached, Caden prepared a small meal for them, using the supplies he had managed to collect and preserve. Lysera watched with curiosity as he prepared it, then accepted the food cautiously. When she tasted it, a soft chirp of approval escaped her throat. Caden laughed quietly. The simple joys of life, food, warmth, safety, had become shared experiences, and they were learning to enjoy them together. Later they settled near the warmth of the geothermal vent, side by side. Lysera curled her tail around her legs and leaned slightly against him, a gesture of trust and affection. Caden placed a hand on her scaled shoulder, feeling the strength and warmth beneath. "We've come a long way," he said softly. "From strangers in a frozen world to partners." This is just the beginning. Lysra responded with a soft hiss, a sound he had come to recognize as agreement. Her eyes reflected the pale light of the moons, intelligent and bright. She had learned to communicate with him, but more importantly, she had learned to rely on him, to trust him, and to understand that she was no longer alone. That trust was fragile, yet unbreakable when nurtured with care and consistency. Caden spent the next days teaching her more about human life beyond survival, how to handle tools carefully, how to recognize simple patterns in the environment, and even how to use small parts of his ship's computer to predict weather changes and potential hazards. Lysra adapted quickly, combining her natural instincts with his guidance. She began to anticipate dangers, suggesting paths to avoid unstable ground or sudden temperature drops. He marveled at her intelligence and resourcefulness. Together they began to plan for the future. Death Moon could only provide so much, and Caden knew that for Lysra to thrive fully, they would need to find a more permanent home. He spoke to her of distant planets, of safer moons, and of places where her kind could exist without fear of isolation or abandonment. Lysra listened carefully, wings twitching slightly in thought, and when he pointed to the sky, she followed his gesture, imagining the worlds beyond their current home. The bond between them deepened in the quiet moments as well. At night, they watched the moons rise and fall, speaking in soft words and gestures. Lysra began to understand affection, companionship, and shared joy. When she flapped her wings playfully or nudged him with her tail, Caden responded with gentle encouragement. They had moved beyond mere survival. They were learning to enjoy life together. One evening, as the twin moons cast a pale glow across the ice, Caden realized that their partnership had grown into something extraordinary. He had found a forsaken dragon woman on a dead moon, alone and primitive, yet now she was his companion, his equal, and his friend. The choice to stay had created a new life, not just for Lysra but for both of them. They settled near the geothermal vent, the warmth radiating through the shelter. Lysra curled against him and he rested his hand on her shoulder. "We'll find a place for you," he said softly. "Somewhere you can soar freely, where you'll never be alone again." Her eyes reflected the light of the moons, bright and hopeful. A soft hiss of agreement escaped her and she nudged him gently. It was simple but it carried meaning: trust, understanding, and acceptance. The harsh world outside could not break the bond they had formed. Together they had learned to survive, to adapt, and to care for one another. Caden knew that life would not be without challenges. Death Moon was harsh, and the journey ahead would be long and uncertain. But with Lysra by his side he felt ready. Together they could face any storm, navigate any danger, and build a future beyond mere survival. They had learned from each other, protected each other, and grown together in ways neither could have imagined. As the night deepened, they watched the moon slowly descend, casting long shadows across the icy landscape. Lysra lifted her wings, testing the air currents, then returned to his side. Caden smiled. Their life together was only beginning, full of possibilities, trust, and hope. The forsaken dragon woman was no longer alone, and the human astronaut had found a new purpose. Under the twin moons of Death Moon, Caden and Lysra sat together, side by side. The winds outside were cold, the world vast and empty, yet inside their small shelter warmth, trust, and companionship thrived. They had survived the impossible, learned from one another, and chosen to face the future together. And in that quiet, glowing sanctuary, a new life had begun. A life of partnership, understanding, and hope that would carry them across the stars.